Hello again, I'm John Rowland and this is the Stratosphere Chamber, and here we are inside the actual Stratosphere Chamber itself. So I thought this time in our little video, and hopefully you might have seen the previous videos underneath and underneath the door, then I thought we would go round the back here and actually start by looking at some of the features which you can't normally see because this airplane's in the way of the actual parts of the chamber and how it worked. So, back here is basically where we've, before we had the, in previous video, we were up basically at that level. Now, that is where the people would come in and out, where you had a hull effectively linked to this ring around here. So, when they had the VC-10 in here, for example, the test section of which is still out in the aircraft park, and you can see the mating parts on the back of it where it actually did line up with this. The whole of the hull would have been bolted to here, so basically creating a pressure seal which would allow you to come in and out of this into the inside of the hull, which is kind of being simulated here by this ex-Vanguard piece, although this is an ex-flying one, which is why it's got instrumentation and things in it. And if you were doing a test piece, it would have been just the hull itself without any of the extra test pieces in there, or instrumentation rather, in there. So we were just inside the Stratosphere Chamber, and out here in the aircraft park we have one of the sections that was tested and passed its testing in the Stratosphere Chamber. So this is a VC-10 section from the nose down to sort of a third of the way along the actual fuselage, and this is a complete section, although there's no fitments or anything inside. It has the flooring and everything in there, so it simulates all the structure that you need to know. And the proof of the fact that this is indeed something, an item that was tested in the Stratosphere Chamber, is round the back here, where as we come round we can see the fitments that were put on the structure to allow it to fit to the back ring on the back of the Stratosphere Chamber, as we saw slightly earlier in the video. So that ring would be attached to some interspacing part which is also attached to the back of the chamber, and that basically formed a pressure seal to allow one then to get in and out of the actual structure and onto the floor that's inside. Now, it looks like there's a sort of blocked door there. Now the reason for that is originally you would have been able to get in and out of this piece when it's being tested. However, shortly after it passed all its internal structural tests done in the Stratosphere Chamber, it was brought outside and put into a special area where they did an ultimate destruction test on it. And that was done by effectively filling this with water and then pumping it up until it burst. And that proved, I can't remember the exact figures, but it burst at about 1.5 times the expected value. So that's one of the items that was tested in the chamber. So we'll now go back and we'll have a look at a few more items in there. If you're not using a structure which is pinned to the side here, there is another way of getting in and out, which is far more common, which is another doorway, which has got a similar pressure door set as we saw, or when Andy Jordan showed upstairs. And now this one goes through into the back, followed by a ladder, which is about 2 or 3 meters down, to get into the back of the chamber, and then you could get in and out of the door, which is around the side. So indeed last week I happened to find somebody who was talking about his time of testing some stuff in here. I can't remember which company he said he was working with, but he'd been shown this door up here, and he said he couldn't work out how they got in and out. So I actually brought him in here and downstairs and showed him the ladder, and he said, oh yes, that's how we got in and out. Now as we also look here, we have the connections, which is where the vacuum would have been sucked out. So that would be the vacuum pumps through various pipework to go to the corner on the far side to where the pumps used to be. And also there's another pipe which goes out into underneath the chamber, which I believe was how they connected the exhaust. For any of you who are running an engine in here at very low temperatures, you had to remove the exhaust gases. So my understanding was they had basically pipework that would attach to that particular opening, and then if you go outside the back of the chamber, you can see sort of some pipe work which was used then to exhaust the gases somewhere up the top. I can't see how it got out of the shed, as I call it, but it certainly got out of the chamber itself through that mechanism. And as you can see, we have here the equal of the ducts that we see when we're on the front of the door. But you also have here, because the air would have been sucked through here, the netting there, which is there to stop items or people, which given you could have a 40-knot wind blowing through there, that'd be probably quite a lot of stuff would get sucked into there if you were unlucky. But so that was put over there to prevent basically all that coming out. Okay, so we've talked about a number of the items around here, including the inlet or the outlet potentially for the vacuum and the exhaust. So I thought we might now have a quick gander, shall we say, down the back of the chamber to see the other sides of this part. And in going in there, it is an area which I've always known as Steve Devereux's workshop. The reason for that is that there was a person called Steve Devereux who joined the museum very early on, about 1989, 1990, and got put in charge, or he may have asked to be put in charge, I'm not sure, of the whole of the Stratosphere chamber, which at that time was quite a mess in many ways. And he did a lot of work over the next 20, 30 years, and unfortunately he died in 2014, which was just when I started working here, so I never really had a chance to get to know him and learn an awful lot of the information he had acquired, on the basis that he, over the years, had talked quite a lot with Spud Borer, who was someone who worked into this quite a lot. So Steve was a fountain of knowledge, and much of which got passed on to other individuals. And hopefully I'm gradually managing to hoover some of that information up so that I can pass that on myself to others. So anyway, if we now quickly go downstairs into the back of the chamber, and we'll have a look at that little area. But now we have to climb over this lot. Watch your head as you come through. Oop, ow. Yep. But as you can see here, there's relics from goodness knows what else in here. It, as I say, this was Mr. Devereux's little space, his workshop. So we have bits that have arrived from many places, including still plenty of boxes of stuff from a Concorde. So I don't quite know what was in them originally, but they've all appear in here. And then we have interesting bits of chicken wire and goodness knows what. But under here, we've when we were in the chamber, we talked about the vacuum pump in terms of its access point. And the pipework here is where the actual vacuum came through, and it goes through into the chamber with a vertically mounted pipe, which we saw. And then it disappears underground and into a trench which is on the far side of this wall. But and we also mentioned about having an exhaust system to remove the exhaust gases. So this pipe here is part of that, and you can see there's a big valve on the end. So that valve is necessary to close that valve if you're going to reduce the pressure inside the chamber. But if it's atmospheric, then you basically will open that up, and then this would be the way out for the exhaust gases, which then disappear out through the onozote into a vertical stack on the other side. There is also a vent here, which I'm not entirely for, which comes down here, which then disappears into what I call the undercroft. So whether that was a way of trying to ventilate down there, I'm not sure. But when we get outside, you can actually see all this stuff disappearing over the roof. And I think it was probably drawn through into what we now call the Vicar's Suite. Not entirely sure. There is a pipe that disappears over there, but without a drone, I wouldn't be able to tell whether these things are connected up. There's no pictures that I've seen of the top that actually shows that. But so I say, I mean, you could only use this sort of system at a normal air pressure, because you'd have to basically try to suck the air through here. And if you're reducing the pressure in the chamber, then that wouldn't exactly work. It'll all kind of blow through rather too fast. But the other interesting point we have here is the random trip hazard, which is only a random trip hazard because, as we had mentioned earlier, this would have been much higher because of the insulation, the ionozote, and that was on the surface. So this would have been probably just at the surface level, I suspect, where we would have been walking at that time. And the other interesting little feature down there is there's a BAE little mat. There were mats put into the workshops, I understand, as it was softer on your feet rather than actually trying to walk on concrete all the time. So it was a way of trying to make people happier, shall we say, doing their work. And there's a lot of other odd little collections of bits and pieces that we gradually go through. Steve Devereux clearly had some connections with the Rolls-Royce and other airlines. And as we do come through here, if we don't trip up on the way, we also mentioned when we were in the back of the chamber that you had to actually climb up steps to get into the lower of the airlocks, and the airlock itself is basically up there. So there's this platform here. So basically you had to climb up to get on the platform to get into the airlock up the top. So basically you would enter through the lobby, shall we say, through this still raised area. So this is probably the final part that actually still has the insulation in place. And then you'd need to use a ladder, like the ladder to our left, or even there's another one actually attached to the wall, and then clamber across to get up into the chamber at the floor level. And of course you can see all the complicated bits of pipe work and so on which are in here to do various things with you've got the heat exchangers in here, and there are drain pipes and various other bits for actually operating that. And you have a very large black cable here, which is one of the power cables. Now I think that is still actually an original power cable. If you go outside you can actually see connections going up and down. Okay, so as we come up these steps that we saw a minute ago, then in here we have what is the lobby area, which leads from the outside, and this door here is an insulated door which comes from the back of the chamber, and it has the sign over the top that says no access, something about experiments or something. I can't remember what it says exactly. But when you come into here, you've got this kind of little bit of a lobby area, and then in the floor there is a manhole, as it were, with a wooden top. But if we were to open that up, then that gives access to what I call the undercroft, which is underneath all of this area, which is put in basically for water purposes, in terms of ensuring that you didn't freeze the water table when the chamber was in operation. But secondly, if we actually have flooding or a very high water table, you can actually fill it to stop the pressures on the wall, which would otherwise cause the foundations to move. And then on your way in and out, you have this fairly massive door, which is an insulating door, given that this is an insulating door and the main one on the outside. But I guess the two in combination is about equivalent to the thickness of the ionozote you have in the main part of the outside. And then as you come through, you can see that even me, and I'm a shorty, there's a very low door, which may be further proof that in practice the people in the 1950s were a little bit shorter than we are today. But anyway, I'm sure people have banged their heads on here in the past. So we've talked about having bolts on the other side, which what you finally used as a way of bolting the whole thing together. Now, on this particular duct, we can see one specific nut which has been added to the system, and then there are three others which we can just about see the top one, and if we move a bit over here, we can see the other one to the left of it. So there we have three of the four nuts rather that is on this particular duct, and each of the four ducts have similar nuts that have been attached. Those would have been how having aligned the bolts to the nuts one could screw the whole thing together and basically pull the door against the we can see the ridge there around there, which is part of the seal, which would basically be pulled into the rubber, which is on the other main part of the door. And of course, we can also see in here the propeller, the fan, one of the 4 fans which were used to circulate the air. And at sea level, you could create about a 40-knot gale force wind, which I'm sure was very useful testing Arctic pieces of kit. But as the chamber went up or the pressure came down, the amount of air that was flowing around would reduce quite significantly, given there's very little of it. But basically, they have 4 of these, 1 in each of the ducts, to allow the air to be circulated. And I seem to remember when we had the bit of filming that we did for the in the control room, we looked at some temperature gauges that were in there, and 3 of the 4 temperature gauges or thermocouples in basically the gearbox for the fans are still working. So one of them is not working, and I don't know which one it is, but we can still measure the temperature of the gearboxes from up in the chamber from the control room if we wish to do so. And as we look to the side, of course, we see the well, firstly, we were actually looking at the fast release gate valve, which is used on the supersonic wind tunnel. So that basically in this control box we have here, which is identified as being from Lockheed, and that's not the American company, that's the UK Lockheed Brakes people. But basically we have a very fast releasing gate valve that's sort of typical of what's used in the oil industry today even, which was say from the 1950s. Now that was then used as the way of taking or releasing the air, shall we say, from the balloon into the chamber when to create the up to Mach 4 speed winds that you could get through there. And then as we come round, we have 2 of the effectively the fan motors, which are painted blue, although they would originally have been duck egg green, and we might get round to restoring that one day. But basically we have, for the lower duct and the upper duct, we have the 2 large motors which drove the fans. As I said, they're big enough to be able to drive the air around at around 40 knots as quite a significant gale at sea level, but not so much at high level. So while we were underneath the chamber, we saw part of the supersonic wind tunnel, including the expansion joints and so on, and then we saw within the chamber itself the cover that goes over the access point where the wind tunnel itself would effectively the air would be sucked when basically they activated the fast acting gate valve, which is the item we have up here, the blue section. And as I said before, things of this nature are still used very much to shut off oil leaks and so on. Indeed, when they had the problem in the Gulf of Mexico, it was one of these sort of valves that didn't quite work, which is one of the reasons they ended up having such a major leak, because they couldn't shut it off. But what we have here is the stub of our supersonic wind tunnel, and if one sees through to the back, which we can now see, which we used not to because we changed all the lighting, there is the plate that goes with the fast-acting gate valve, which is the gunmetal grey item with some horizontal sort of white or lighter stripes across. So that gate, basically, when it would operate, would disappear within under a second, so probably 800 milliseconds. The whole thing would vanish, and the airflow would then be able to start. And within this, which is actually only the stub of the supersonic wind tunnel, because the actual works were behind where we're standing in the Vickers Suite and is no longer there. But as the pictures show over here, you have elements which are behind this wall. And so this is a picture of what the test area or test chamber section with some form of missile. I'm not quite sure what that is. Which has been mounted, and they would be a camera, I believe it's this item here, which is a fast camera which also is able to, using polarized light, you can actually see all the shock waves that come off the relevant parts. So there'll be a shock wave coming off the front and on these fins. So you would examine the nature of those and look to minimize them, because shock waves basically are wasting energy and cause other problems, shall we say, particularly in an aircraft situation. So if we look at the actual model we have inside the chamber here, I discovered quite recently that that is a Supermarine, or Vickers Supermarine, Type 589. Now, I had to then look up what that was and discovered that it is effectively an early model, shall we say, or development, which ultimately turned into the Tornado. Now, the Tornado itself was an aircraft which the contract with Panavia, who was the consortium, was in 1969. So clearly this model came before that. And I discovered this particular model was at the latter end of a series which started with the Type 581. Now, the 581 was a variable geometry model being developed, from the TSR-2. So the TSR-2 was basically being built in the early 60s, cancelled in the 1964. So the Type 581 was around 1961 when that was actually there. So that then developed through another couple of iterations into the 589. Now, possibly an interesting fact. I always think these facts are interesting. But you can see here that we have basically ramp-type air intakes for the engines. Now, those ramp-type air intakes are very similar to the sort of thing that Concorde would have had. Originally, they were planning to put what's known as a shock cone as opposed to a ramp intake, which is a much more complex, in aerodynamic terms, way of actually dissipating the shock and allowing the air into the engine to be subsonic when the aircraft is flying at, say, Mach 2. Now, this was becoming a project involving the Germans, particularly in terms of variable geometry, as I say, turning ultimately into the Tornado. And at the time, they basically didn't want to give away all the technology about the shock cones, which they developed with TSR-2. So they basically reverted back to a much simpler ramp intake, which is what you see here. So that actually dates this to be a very late version of the 589, because the early ones still had the shock cone on it. And this would have been around 1964. So in one of the early videos we had about the chamber, Andy Jordan introduced the area here, and he mentioned about the black box that we can see here, which is made up of largely onazote, which is an insulating material from the 1940s. And we have a few pieces of that here, one of which is this, and it's extremely light. It is in aerated bakelite, as far as we're aware. So this is a kind of equivalent of a polystyrene of today from the 1940s. And the interesting part about, well, I think it's interesting anyway, of this particular piece is this little wooden peg. Because originally, when they put the whole structure together, they used wooden pegs to hold each of the slabs of onazote into place. And the reason they wanted to use the wooden pegs was to stop the cold coming along and through any metal items that were put through, because they were basically looking to get the best insulation they could. Unfortunately, by the late 50s, this was starting to fall apart, particularly where it gets bashed into by trolleys and things around the bottom. So they decided to actually go away from the theory of not having any metal parts. And if we actually look at the box, we can see some brown wooden planks down the side, and there are square items all the way up, which are the ends of bolts that go through into the frame of the chamber, of the cover of the chamber. Now, at that point, they then would have had the interesting feature, no doubt, of when it was particularly cold, you'd probably get big ice accretions coming down and probably big icicles hanging from all of those metal parts, because the cold would be coming through and it would be well below freezing at that point. But, and later on, they then put some, I think it must be linen type cover, and they painted it with, I suspect it's bitumen paint, and around the bottom section, which actually sticks out slightly, you'll find that there are plyboard that's been put on there as a resistance to trolleys being whacked into it or whatever. And as we go round the corner, We have the methanol sign warning them not to catch the place on fire by smoking in this area, which I'm told it's really did rather stink of methanol and ammonia. And those are the doors we're looking at there, which allow you access to the heat exchangers to allow you to remove the matrix that's inside. And again, as we had been inside in the little lobby, this is the door from the outside into that lobby. So as it says here, test in progress, danger, restricted entry. We don't let anyone in there anyway, but I do find it slightly amusing that this is a very old piece of signage, but the door has expanded by quite a lot. So there's a big gap in the middle of that sign. Well, that's the end of another little video to put together, in this case in and around the chamber. We've had another couple of videos we've already done, and we hope we'll be able to see you again in the not too distant future in some other videos that we intend to do around this place. Thank you.